your communities. I am Anu Natarajan, former Vice Mayor, Council Member of Fremont, and currently the Housing Initiative Lead at Meta or Facebook. And I will serve as your moderator today. As we all know, California and much of the nation is grappling with a housing crisis, a crisis of undersupply, a crisis of homelessness, affordability, a crisis of access, and climate, and much more. The purpose of today's discussion is to surface these issues and really to connect you with resources in the region that you can rely on. For first-time candidates who are ramping up on all aspects of city governance, we want to let you know that you have access to great folks that are deep in the work of finding solutions to the housing crisis. We have an amazing group of women who had organizations that work with all aspects of affordable housing in the South Bay, East Bay, and Peninsula. And I want to thank the three of them for taking the time to be with us today. And I will introduce them in a minute. The format for today's conversation, we will tee it up with short presentations. I have a set of questions for the panelists, and we hope to have enough time at the end to respond to your questions. We may not get to answer all of your questions today, but we will commit to responding to them after today's webinar. So please feel free to use the Q&A function to post your questions and the chat button to share your thoughts. With that, let me introduce the three panelists. Gloria Bruce is Executive Director at East Bay Housing Organization, or EBO, a leading advocacy coalition promoting affordable housing in Alameda and Contra Costa counties. She oversees all aspects of organizational development and leads several policy and coalition campaigns. Prior to joining EBO in 2010, Gloria worked at the San Francisco Foundation, making grants to support affordable housing, safety net services, and neighborhood revitalization. Gloria has 15 years of experience in social justice and community development in her native Washington, D.C. area, Boston, and the Bay Area. She lives in Oakland with her wife and two young sons. Evelyn Stivers comes to Housing Leadership Council with 20 years of organizing and advocacy experience. Before joining HLC, Evelyn was the development director for Urban Habitat. And prior to that, Evelyn worked for the Nonprofit Housing Association on regional initiatives that included housing elements, inclusionary housing campaigns, and many more. She served on boards of Transform, the League of Conservation Voters of the East Bay, and EBO. And third, we have Regina Celestin Williams. She is the Executive Director of SB at Home, where she leads the policy and advocacy for affordable housing in Silicon Valley. Prior to joining SB at Home, she served as Director of Housing Development at First Community Housing, a San Jose-based affordable housing developer. She has also worked at the National Housing Trust, structuring financing for and overseeing the rehabilitation process of resident-occupied affordable housing properties, and at times working with tenant ownership groups. Born and raised in Richmond, California, Regina has called San Jose home for several years, having both of her daughters here in the heart of Silicon Valley. With that, let me start with questions. I want to have each one of you talk a little bit about your organizations and the work that you've been focused on. Let me start with Gloria.
Thank you so much, Anu. Thanks everybody for being here. We're glad that you're taking your lunch hour with us. I will save most of my speaking for when I do my initial presentation, but just to say that my organization, EBHO, works all across Alameda and Contra Costa counties. So that's what we define as the East Bay. And we are a resource here for policy advocacy. We do a lot of work with local cities and with electeds. We organize residents of affordable homes. We organize residents who are allies for housing justice. And we do a lot of education and leadership development programs. So we're working on a number of campaigns, but I'll get into that more later during my talk. Thank you.
Regina.
Hello, everyone. So glad to be here. I have a couple of slides to talk about SV at Home, but we are Santa Clara County wide, And we actually have a 501c3 and a 501c4 that allows us to do a little bit more political activity. And I'm so excited to be here and share what SB at Home does and what we believe. And also some other things about affordable housing and the crisis that we find ourselves in.
Thank you. Evelyn?
Yes, thank you. Evelyn Stivers, Executive Director of Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County. We work in San Mateo County with communities and their leaders to create and preserve quality, affordable homes. Our vision is a San Mateo County where everyone that grew up here, who lives here now, or who works in the county can afford a decent place that they can afford.
Thank you. So let's begin with trying to define what the housing crisis means from your perspective, and how do we get here? Regina, I'm going to start with you on this one. Regina, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. So thank you for asking that question, Anu. Again, a little bit about SB at Home. We are a 501c3 that was established in 2015, a 501c4, our SB at Home Action Fund that was established in 2019. And so we are grateful to have two organizations really to support building more affordable housing in Santa Clara County. Our mission is to drive the creation of affordable housing for a more vibrant and equitable Silicon Valley. And we believe that housing is a human right. Diversity makes us stronger. Centering equity and inclusion in our work is key. Housing policy is not just about housing. It's about, access to jobs, education, safety, health, and there are a lot of other things that are determined by housing. And the most important principle for today is working together in partnership is more impactful. So at SB at Home, we try to work in partnership with a lot of organizations in the space. Collaboration is very central to how we do our work. And I just want to emphasize that there are a plethora of partners that we enjoy working with, some based in your communities, some throughout Santa Clara County, and some throughout the Bay Area that we think are very critical to pushing this work forward as we look to build a Silicon Valley, a region where people can live and thrive. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we got here, with this historic sort of housing crisis that we see in this moment. And a lot of it has to do with the legacy and current practices of segregation, of discrimination, and a long and established history of redlining. As many of you may know, there was practices that were reinforced through lending by the federal government. And in fact, from the period of 1934 to 1968, 98% of home loans and mortgages went to white families. And so there was a lot of discrimination. These redlining maps, like the one that I have on the screen for the city of San Jose, would divide cities into areas that were good for investment and to lend and allow folks to become homeowners, and bad for investment, ones that may have had a higher concentration of racial and ethnic groups, and there was discouragement from investing and lending to homeowners or potential homeowners in those areas. And what we've seen is that a lot of that sort of segregation, and racist sort of separation of who is allowed to live in certain neighborhoods and build wealth and have access to certain resources and opportunities, and who is not, more importantly, and whose neighborhood is disinvested, continues today. One example of that is this particular map that shows the same city of San Jose, California, and it shows the dispersion of single-family home zoning within the city of San Jose. So you can see that the pink spaces are the areas of the city that are zoned as single-family zoning for single-family homes. And that's 94% of the city is zoned that way. However, only 50% of San Jose's residents are able and live in single-family homes. So what does that mean for the rest of the residents, the other half that live in multifamily units? Well, there are very few areas that are allowed to build those multifamily residences. And that's why you have certain legislation like SB 9 and SB 10, where we really push for opening up single family zoning so that there's equity and there's continued equity and not exclusion through zoning. And a lot of our work focuses on that, on really breaking down barriers to living in all parts of the city, and also creating a city that can accommodate all of the folks who live and work here. Another thing I wanted to talk about in terms of just the dynamics of that are particular to this area in Silicon Valley is the ratio of jobs being created to housing being created. Now, this is really impactful because as you can see, the history is the recent history between 2010, the state is between 2010 and 2019, is that we have a ratio of 7 jobs being created to 1 housing unit being created. So this is saying that, as we know, Silicon Valley is an economic engine, lots of success, wealth building, economic, generation, which is great. We have a successful economy. However, the creation of housing has not kept up to accommodate the success of this economy. And if we want to continue to have economic success, it's very, very important that we not only have a balanced ratio to accommodate the jobs being created and the folks coming from all parts of this country and this world to work here in this thriving economy, but to catch up, because we're continuing to fall behind in terms of the housing being provided. And that's why we see so many folks falling out of housing into situations where they're being unhoused or being displaced from our community and from our region. The next data spreadsheet that I wanted to share with you has to do with sort of the high cost that's tied to this sort of market dynamic. That's the push and pull of supply and demand, and where the market is in terms of who can afford to live here. So what you can see is the annual income to own a home is $212,000 for a family. That's much above what any one of these positions would earn, all the way from a healthcare support occupations person to a police officer. So on their own, you already need at least 2 full-time working folks in a home to be able to own a single family home. But even when we look at the levels that are required, the levels of income that are required to rent, there are some challenges. You could be right in the middle, a construction laborer, and you're still well below the ability to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. You could be an elementary school teacher and be making a living wage. However, if you have a family, that 1-bedroom apartment is going to feel too small or too tight of living arrangements. So you still need a couple of working folks to really be able to qualify. And or to be able to afford to live here. And so what we have is a lot of folks who are overburdened by rent. And that means that they may be paying the rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, but they can't really afford it. So a lot of their income goes to pay that rent, and that makes them vulnerable to other things that they may need, like food, transportation, clothing, the basic essentials for their family. All of those things become very hard to pay for when you're spending so much of your income on your rent. And so this is just to highlight how a lot of folks really are right at that threshold, or really far below it. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and allow the questions to continue.
Thank you, Regina. So Gloria, Regina talked about who's impacted by this crisis. Could you set for us the context using the 3P framework and what affordable housing actually means?
Absolutely. And thank you, Regina, for I think it's really important that people do understand the long-term context of how we got here. And I always say that the affordable housing crisis in the Bay Area is not something that popped up in the last 2 years during the pandemic, or the last 5 years, or the last 10. It's actually decades in the making, and it had racialized overtones, as you see from that slide. And what that means is we're going to need a range of interventions to fix it. We're going to need to be intentional with an eye to race and class and other issues. And we're going to need to take an eye towards the long term. I'm going to share my screen as well. And while that's coming up, I'm just going to say that, Regina shared some maps and statistics, and they're specific to San Jose and Santa Clara County, but the trends are the same. Evie and I could show similar maps and images in San Mateo or in Contra Costa County, and you would see the same trends popping up here. So what my job is to talk about, like, what even is affordable housing? What are we actually even talking about here? What does it mean? How do we try to solve everything that Regina was just talking about? So my organization does a lot of trying to demystify these terms, and also really trying to ground us in some principles for intervention. And I listed a few here that I hope will be particularly relevant to the 40 or so city council members and candidates on this call. One being, I could go on with these all day, but I'm just picking a few. One being that we really believe that homes solve homelessness. May not be the only solution that a particular person needs, although sometimes it is. But there's a reason why I highlighted the letters home in the word homelessness, because I think very few of your jurisdictions aren't untouched in some way by the fact that there are too many people who are unhoused. And if we really want to get out of that situation, we have got to have simply more homes that people can afford and that are healthy and that are stable. The other piece here about affordable housing being a worthwhile investment, I think it's something you can talk with constituents about, that affordable housing is not necessarily cheap. No housing is cheap to build in the Bay Area. It can be close to $1 million per unit to build an apartment. Whether you're talking about an affordable apartment or a market rate apartment, they're built with the same labor. In fact, usually with union labor, if it's affordable housing, with the same materials, with the same land costs often. But doing nothing is actually more expensive to deal with the consequences. So if we want to have the diversity, health, prosperity, success in education that I think we all agree on, affordable housing can support all of these things. Public funds and government action is a really big piece of that. One thing I like to mention is that the types of organizations that EBHO works with, who are nonprofits who build and manage affordable housing, they really leverage public funds. So we had a county bond a few years ago where for every $1 that the county put into affordable housing, these private nonprofit organizations were able to leverage that 9 times over through using other sources of funds, private lending, and other ways. That's a really important thing to remember. Transparency is really key. And also we believe that public funds should focus on those who are in greatest need, who won't necessarily be served by the market. And how do we do that? We focus on what's called the 3 Ps. So we want to protect, preserve, and produce homes, so that to give us a more prosperous Bay Area. Let me go into that just a little bit further. What do I mean by the 3 Ps? First, protecting people in their current homes. This really refers to things like tenant protections, educating people on their rights, helping seniors age in place, maybe with a home rehab, helping somebody with a small grant to catch up with their rent. Let's not have people slipping into the housing crisis stream in the first place. Let's protect people where they are. We also, of course, need to produce or build or create homes of all types, all densities, all income levels, but ones that people can afford. We simply need more homes that rent or sell at a price point that people can afford. And third, we need to preserve what we have that is working. So if we have older properties that maybe need to be fixed up or might be at danger of being bought and converted into more expensive condos, let's look at ways that we can make sure that we hold those properties in community hands, that we fix them up and make them safe and affordable for the long term. And then Regina reminded me to make sure to emphasize sort of a fourth additional P, which is prevent. We definitely want to, as I said, we want to stop people from falling into housing instability or homelessness in the first place. And that might mean interventions that aren't brick and mortar. It might mean giving someone a rapid rehousing grant. It might mean giving someone tenant counseling or foreclosure counseling. There's a lot of different ways that we can prevent having more people go onto those housing wait lists. So how do we do that? There's a lot here. I'm not going to be able to go over all of this, but there are a lot of different ways to define affordable housing. And so on the left, I have when I tell people I work in affordable housing, they usually come up with a couple of things, which are all good and all real. They say, oh, that just means a house where the rent is cheap. Or as we tend to call those in the field, naturally occurring affordable housing. The problem is that this type of housing barely exists anymore in the Bay Area. The idea that you can get a decent, and I do mean decent, home or apartment that just happens to be inexpensive, even if you commute way out, I think we all know that this is a dying breed of just housing that happens to be cheaper in the market, but isn't managed by a slumlord. So what else do we have? Well, people will also say, oh, you mean Habitat for Humanity? Yes, Habitat for Humanity, wonderful organization, uses sweat equity and other means to build home ownership opportunities. That's great, but there's lots of other interventions as well. Sometimes people will say, oh, what you mean is public housing or Section 8. Both of these are programs that are run by what's known as a housing authority, which is usually based in a city or in a county. And these are still incredibly important programs, but I should note that public housing in the old sense of the term, with all of the connotations that come with that, as in it's actually government owned and built, there is actually not that much pure public housing left in the Bay Area. A lot of it has been redeveloped through public-private partnerships. There is some, it is important. It's not actually the primary mode of most recent affordable housing though. And I also think that a lot of people's unfortunately misconceptions that are formed by a very systematic stigmatization and defunding of affordable housing really rest with public housing. And also with this other program, Section 8, which people have heard of. And I want to emphasize, this is a really key program because it allows people to have a voucher from the government that they can go and rent on the private market and have a guaranteed rent to that landlord and be able to be mobile with that. So these are all important interventions, but they're not the only ones. The ones that Regina and Evie and I are probably usually working on are things you may not have heard of. So one of them is called low-income housing tax credit housing. It's funded by a particular government and state administered tax program. And a lot of the recent rental affordable housing that you might see or know of may come from this type of housing program. So what I'm going to do is show you that there's actually a couple of different ways that this can look, because you might be thinking in your heads, there we go. Okay, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about affordable rental housing. So for those who need the visual description, I now have behind me a picture of a rather large 4-story multifamily apartment building. This is based in Oakland. It's a wonderful apartment building. It's right next to a BART station. It was built by a nonprofit and through public-private partnership and this particular tax credit program. But I want to emphasize, this isn't how tax credit housing or how affordable housing has to look. Let me give you another example. Now this one, it is taller. It's an older building in Oakland, and this is actually representative of the second bullet point that I have here, permanent supportive housing, which is actually for those who are of the very lowest incomes and might need some additional services. This is what's known as an SRO, or single room occupancy. Used to be a residential hotel, and now it houses formerly homeless folks in downtown Oakland through a renovation of this historic building, which has now been preserved. But I want to show you one more example after I take away this sort of 6-story brick building. Okay, this is in Pleasanton in Alameda County, and you can see the buildings here, or if you need the visual description, I'm surrounded by, I have a basketball court and a park behind me and several buildings that are actually just 2 stories. And what I'm trying to show here is that affordable housing of the types on the right is going to look very different in Oakland than it's going to look in Concord or in Walnut Creek or in Pleasanton or the other places that we work. The folks who develop permanent supportive housing and tax credit housing have a lot of sensitivity to local context, and also zoning and land use laws, which you all as local officials can control, dictate what's going to happen here. And this is just another model. So there's also a couple of other models that I won't get into, but just to mention, you may also be hearing of things like community land trusts. And then there are also other interventions such as home ownership or down payment assistance and accessory dwelling units. So 1 or 2 points that I want to make. Oh, and I'll just say accessory dwelling units are like small, what we used to call granny flats or in-law units that people might have in their backyards. Another way to get some affordability. Next, okay. I don't tend to use the word subsidized housing because there's a lot of stigma to that. And I'm going to just tell you why. So the picture on the left is an example of subsidized housing. These are 2 properties built by an organization called Eden Housing on the former naval base in Alameda. I think they're great. There's a beautiful park in between them. They house very low income seniors. And yes, they have subsidies from that tax credit program I told you about. And this is what people tend to think about. The property on the right is my house in Oakland. And the reason why I have that here is because I'm a homeowner, and my ability to be a homeowner is actually also subsidized by the federal government to the tune of the mortgage interest tax deduction. And for those people who may have an FHA loan or way back in the day who had a GI loan, that is also a government subsidy. So the point that I'm making here is that the government has used subsidies for housing to achieve many different public policy goals for many different incomes over the years, sometimes in a just way, sometimes less so. And so we need to let go of the idea that subsidized housing is a bad thing or a cheap thing or an undesirable thing. I happen to like my subsidized housing. Finally, Regina touched on this, but I just want to drive it home a little more because every time I look at these numbers, it's kind of mind-boggling to me. So again, if you remember sort of one acronym from today, well, there's probably a couple, but area median income is a big one. As Regina said, that's the number in your county or your jurisdiction above which half of the people have a higher income, half of the people have a lower income than that number. These 3 income levels are generally what's used to determine who is eligible for affordable housing programs that are publicly funded. And so anyone under 80% of the area median income in that green column is considered low income. These numbers blow my mind. In Alameda County, for one person, you are low income if you make less than $76,750. And if you have a 4-person household, you are low income if you make less than $109,600. So you can see the rest of the numbers here, and it's really, I mean, basically, it's almost as if your household isn't in the 6 figures, then technically you could qualify for affordable housing. I think that just shows you the vast spread of incomes and income inequality in the Bay Area. So the other thing I want to note is that these types of these types of statistics are also available on our website. It looks like I can't drop them in the chat to everyone, but I'll do that later. We have a study room that actually has an extensive chart of what all of these mean and all these definitions. Finally, with thanks to Evie, who lent these pictures and numbers to me, just to give you an example of what that actually means, because I think a lot of us in the housing world often hear people say, well, I want to build housing for working people. And while I personally don't believe that whether or not you are in an economically productive job should determine whether you have a roof over your head, I think everyone deserves a roof over their head. The fact of the matter is that most people who live in affordable housing are working people. They have to be, they pay rent. It's just that you can work really hard in our area and not make very much, as Regina said. So you have some examples here of a custodian, a retail worker who are easily under that 50% AMI and would qualify for very low income housing. Domestic care workers, even lower than that, and would fall into the extremely low income category. So I just want to leave you with that, that these AMI levels are really important, that these are real people we're talking about who contribute to our community. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass it. Oh, I'll pass it on to Evie, but there's my email and our website. Just a second.
Thank you, Gloria. And thank you all to all three of you for responding to some of the questions that are up there, and we'll get to the ones that are still on there. But before we go there, Evelyn, I'm sure a lot of our participants today, council members, candidates running for office, have heard of the housing element, have heard of RENA. Could you talk a little bit about how the housing allocation is done, what that means for each of the cities?
Yes, absolutely. Let me pull up my screen. So this is just about us. So so in the state of California, every city and county is required to do what's known as a housing element. And a housing element is basically a contract with the state of California showing that they will meet their housing need. Now, the housing need is determined in part from the state looks at what kind of economic growth we expect to see over the next 20 years. Then they divide up that projected growth and the projected housing need for each region. Our region is the Association of Bay Area Governments, which includes 9 counties, including the ones that are represented here, and also the North Bay and San Francisco. And then ABAG uses a very intricate methodology of looking at transportation investments, new jobs that have been added, and past production to come up with a formula for the regional housing need allocation. It's basically a number that states the minimum amount of housing that a city and county needs to plan for. Yeah, but when you're doing the planning, there's more to the housing element than just the RENA. In that contract, in that housing plan, that housing element, you also need to look at your local needs and constraints. So if your population, if you have a large population of people with developmental disabilities, the state is going to make sure that you look at that and that you take that into consideration when you're doing your housing plan. So one of the requirements is that the city or county work with the local community on determining what the local needs are, what the constraints are for developing the housing in the current environment, and coming up with programs to overcome those constraints, and specific sites with an APN number, like very specific sites that are distributed throughout the city so that we are affirmatively furthering fair housing or trying to eliminate past segregation patterns like the ones shown in Regina's very first map. And this is a lot, and I'm sorry if this is too thick, but all these things need to be in the plan for city councils on how to get those things in the plan. And it's really important to know that this is enforced. So right now, the state of California has invested a lot more money in making sure that all the plans are reviewed, and that there is an accountability unit of 25 HCD staffers that are looking at our housing plans and making sure that we're not only passing good plans, but implementing them. So let's just talk about it a little bit more. What are some of the incentives? There's a ton of incentives for cities to do a good plan. You can get access to grants for everything from infrastructure to more buses, transportation, affordable housing, bike lanes, and planning grants, which can be really important for paying for staff. And in addition, there's a pro-housing designation, which actually prioritize your city or county to get first dibs on those grants, which can be incredibly powerful tool for doing the kind of planning that a city needs to do. Conversely, not having a plan can be very problematic. The rules have been loosened on who can enforce housing elements in the state of California. So all of you have probably read headlines where our Secretary of State, Rob Bonta, has sent out letters and enforced sent letters to different cities throughout the state asking them to either implement their current housing plan or to pass a housing plan. Some cities have lost their status as having a certified housing element for not implementing certain policies and programs. Developers can sue. So in the city of Millbrae and in San Mateo County, a developer had a development that was consistent with the housing element, and the city didn't allow it to be, didn't approve it. And the developer sued and won. And that project is moving forward. Third parties can sue. So, and this is maybe the most common. In Menlo Park, for example, 3 organizations collectively got together and sued the city of Menlo Park because they did not have a housing element. And then individuals can sue. There was just one individual involved in the Clover lawsuit, in the city of Clover's lawsuit, and that was successful. So lots of enforcement. And non-compliance can have huge consequences for jurisdictions. Not only do you not get access to funding, but I don't know if you've seen the headlines recently, but in Redondo Beach, one of the builders is moving forward with an entitlement of 2,500 homes under the builder's remedy because Redondo Beach does not have a certified housing element. We have seen in the past loss of permitting authority. So cities can't change zoning. They can't authorize second units or other small changes because the courts have found that without a housing element, they don't have a general plan. Without a general plan, how can you issue permits? First settlement agreements that cost the city lots of money, and they have to do the plans anyway. And some new things, there are financial penalties for up to $600,000 a month for a jurisdiction. This has not been imparted to any city yet, but these are new rules. And also, this also hasn't happened yet, but could happen, is a court-ordered rewrite of zoning code or city receivership, which I hope we don't get to with any community. So these are some of the consequences and some of the challenges of not meeting your RHNA or your housing element requirement or your housing plan requirement.
Thank you, Evelyn. Oh, do you want some more? Thank you. And as cities in the Bay Area complete their housing element update and get it adopted, I think the work is just beginning in terms of implementing some of the policies and goals. And I think as housing advocates and local electeds, we all have a responsibility to see that those get implemented and get the resources needed to do that. So this has been a week of the governor signing housing bills, some really important ones. So could you, each one of you, address this question of the role of state legislators in addressing housing and land use issues? And also talk about 1 or 2 bills, both in this cycle and potentially previous cycles, that have had a positive impact in addressing the housing crisis. Regina?
Sure, I can go first. I think that what we know to be true is that land use regulation and zoning has a problematic history, not just in our state, but in our country, but particularly in this region, we have absolutely been affected by the land use regulation and zoning acting as a barrier to building enough housing in an equitable way where everyone has access. And so, we believe that the role of the state government is to recognize that it's a lot to put it on any one jurisdiction in the state to solve this housing crisis that we find ourselves in. And in support of allowing jurisdictions to do their job better of housing the people and serving the community that is within their jurisdiction, there's been several policies at the state level that have passed over the last 4 or 5 years that have been really impactful and sort of better equip local jurisdictions in moving forward in a way that holds and cares for all of its people. And so I think SB 35 and SB 330 and state legislations that have sort of provided density bonuses and streamlining that allows for projects to move forward, kind of takes the weight of, away from the local electeds, of having to try to figure out, what's the right balance, and really supports you all in being able to build more housing while explaining to your constituents how you're going to continue to use your planning departments and your internal city processes to be thoughtful about informing the housing that gets built into your communities while allowing it to happen. And so that's sort of our perspective, is that the state legislation allows, relieves pressure from the local jurisdictions, and also allows you all to care for your communities in ways that are in line with the work that's going on throughout the state to relieve some of this built up demand for housing. Understanding that if only one jurisdiction is doing it and another one is not doing their fair share, then it just gets really hard and difficult for each respective jurisdiction.
Gloria?
That was a really good answer that Regina gave. And I think the only thing I would elaborate on is just to say that, again, what the state laws do is either sometimes they create a baseline from which cities can work. Sometimes they kind of create parameters that you work within. In a state as large as California, there is no way state legislation can account for the conditions in every single individual jurisdiction. And that's why there is still a lot of local land use control in an individual city or town or unincorporated area. And it's why, for example, Evie just talked about the housing element process, which is the perfect example of how the state decided, well, housing is of the statewide concern. If we just leave housing planning completely up to jurisdictions on their own with no parameters, then we have the situation that we've landed in over the past decades, where some cities are more pro-housing and build a ton of housing, and other cities don't, and you have this gross imbalance and terrible commutes and exclusionary communities. And so the state was like, all right, we have to do something with tougher housing element laws. But within those tougher housing element laws, where the state is setting its standard and saying, you have to do this, you have to plan for that, you have to make sure you're consulted with the community in these ways. The state is not dictating their rules, but it's up to the city to say, okay, we know our land. We're going to talk to the people in the city and figure out what are the sites that make the sense within the rules set by the state, but there's still some local decision-making there. And the last example I'd give is something called the State Surplus Land Act, which is a statewide policy that dictates when there's a public agency that's going to sell or lease its land that it no longer needs. Could be a city, a school district, BART, Caltrans, that it has to go through a certain process to offer up that land for community needs or housing sponsors. And in the end, the city can decide to sell to whom it wants and do its own negotiations, but the state sets those parameters. And so, as Regina said, hopefully that actually relieves some pressure on local officials.
Evelyn, anything to add to that?
No, that is all very, very good.
Great. So there's a question about, we'll get to the cost of construction and why that's such a huge challenge and some of the other roadblocks to actually producing housing. There's a question about the impact of infrastructure costs, like how do we take care of traffic, water when housing is built, and how does the land use and planning tie into building these new houses? So I guess the question basically is, as we are building housing, we're doing the housing element, what about the regional things that don't know city boundaries, like our transportation options, water infrastructure, and others that are more regional in context. So what's the relationship between local land uses and more the regional issues?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I can share is the governor did just sign AB 2011. And so that's a bill that really incentivizes building on land that has been designated as commercial or industrial, I think primarily commercial, but really being able to build housing and mixed use there when it's adjacent to transit and other existing infrastructure. So one thing that we do, going back to the idea of really connecting to partners, is understand the full picture of what it takes to have a successful and vibrant and sustainable community. And that is partnering with advocacy organizations that are very much, understand what we need to do to preserve the environment and the risk of climate change and the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the fact that, low-income people are not only affected by the housing shortage, but the cost of transportation and their desire to use public transportation versus personal vehicles. And so we all sort of work together, not only in sort of affecting policy and legislation, but also in coming up with solutions and how to plan for our communities in a more sustainable way, and talk about, building housing near the existing infrastructure, especially when it comes to transit, being able to reduce parking requirements. There was a bill, AB 2097, that was signed by the governor, that reduces parking requirements. That is in an effort to reduce greenhouse gases as well, and traffic, and hoping that if we continue to build close to transit and existing infrastructure, that we can get some more density, some more housing, without really polluting the air more and clogging our streets and our roads more. So there is a lot of synergies between different movements, both the transportation and public transportation movement, and also movement around environmental sustainability.
Jan, you've said a couple times that you think we should go back to public housing. There is a lot of conversation about public housing, also called social housing. So we'd love for you to be plugged in and give us ideas on what you think needs to happen in that arena. There's a question from Robert. Do you support some variation of 100% affordable housing zoning overlays?
I think that's a tool that is commonly used by all three of our organizations, especially in housing elements, and especially for publicly owned or quasi-publicly owned sites, right? So it's a really important resource that cities and counties have, is sites that are owned not even necessarily by the jurisdiction, but by the mosquito abatement district, or some other government agency might own land that they're no longer using for that primary purpose that might be available for affordable homes. And that's overlay zone is a really great tool that cities can use to make sure that they're doing the planning on the traffic and the water and all the infrastructure, but also making room for housing.
So just following up on that, we've heard some conversation, some discussion from each one of you about some of the elements that add cost to construction. And in the Bay Area, especially, the cost of construction is probably the highest anywhere in the country. So what are some of the elements that lead to this increase in costs, and just the challenges of building housing? Gloria?
Oh, there's a lot of pieces here. It's a lot of different things. It depends on what housing you're talking about. I mean, I think in general, what I was just in a meeting yesterday with the head of housing for Alameda County, who was saying that by her estimate, there are certain construction costs that have almost doubled in the last like 5 to 10 years. So it's, I mean, we're all seeing the effects of inflation and disrupted supply chains, but just in general, everything that goes into building housing is just much more expensive than it used to be. And that is out of the control of the affordable housing industry for the large part. And the other thing that is challenging is that I think affordable housers are often supposed to be at the vanguard of watching costs because it's public money, and we should be scrutinizing how the taxpayer money is used. But at the end of the day, affordable housing is also asked to be extremely green, built with union labor, extremely safe, very sustainable, next to transit. It should be all of those things, but those things actually cost money. And so I think we actually focus more on, like, as I said before, this is actually an expensive thing to do. We do need to find ways to make it more expensive, but it's not cheap to build communities that are worth living in. So I will stand by that. But you know, one thing I would say is that it is really important for us to keep exploring things like smaller housing profiles, different kinds of innovations, looking again at ADUs like we talked about, and then also different construction methods. So I think a lot of housing, including probably the one right behind me, is still built using essentially the same construction techniques that have been used for 100 years. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's good quality housing. We want long-lasting housing. And there are other ways to build quality homes, such as modular housing, such as cross-laminated timber. We need to be looking at these new technologies and bringing them to scale as well.
Regina or Evelyn, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, this particular affordable housing, this part of the sector, absolutely is tied to all of the market forces and dynamics and labor costs, materials costs, you know, of the luxury housing market as well. There's a close tie between, you know, the contractors that we use in affordable housing, the designers, the engineers. And so the costs are the cost. And on all sides of the housing sector, there's pent up demand. The folks who work to build these buildings don't have access to housing they can afford in the areas that they're working. And so there's the cost of, you know, commuting from long distances, and attracting those folks into the region to continue to build our housing. There's so many dynamics that have been created by the housing shortage. And it is really, you know, challenging to overcome the costs that are rising and rising. But a lot of them, you know, are tied to the fact that there is such a housing shortage and that it's so expensive to live here. So it's sort of like everything is interconnected, and we have to understand the value of a home in the sense of the fact that it is safe and it's stable and it's shelter. And remember that there are a lot of folks who invest, especially in this area, in housing as if it is just an asset or a commodity. And so there's tensions between that as well, and the value and cost. And so it's like, when you're talking about housing as a human right, is there really a cost that you put on that, knowing that there's been such neglect in building enough housing for so many decades? So, because we really are talking about the value of people's lives. There's so many stories about people who are unhoused and how, you know, they can't live through another winter or another month or another week. And so when we talk about, you know, public service and public responsibility, we know that housing is at the top of the list, building enough housing for everyone. And the cost is something that won't be managed until we sort of build enough housing. And that's why there's innovation, but innovation also has a cost. If you know or have worked in tech, there's usually an R&D team, and no one thinks twice about the cost of that team that doesn't produce revenue or generate revenue. They just have a cost associated with them because they're innovating, and that's going to pay off in the long run. And that's some of the things that Gloria mentioned, like modular and panelized construction. Now we're starting to see that there's also a cost to that. And until we innovate enough to get to a new construction technology, we won't see the cost go down.
Thank you. To David's question about why industrial zone lands were not included in the recent law, I'm assuming you're talking about AB 2011. It's also because commercial sites are provide infill opportunities close to other amenities, and industrial zones are usually at the edges of the cities and really not connected to services. We did a detailed analysis of the kinds of commercial lands and how much that will produce. So you can find a blog post of that at Urban Footprint on their website. They've done a detailed analysis of what's available through 2011. Gloria, you talked about the AMIs, the 80% and below, and the way we've categorized affordable housing there. The other big challenge that we're all looking at is this middle income housing for folks that make between 80% and 120% of AMI. That doesn't fall under the category of subsidized housing and does not have the opportunities for funding. And then the market rate housing is out of reach for the folks in the middle. So what are your thoughts and what are your organizations doing around this whole middle income, missing middle housing?
Thank you for the question. This is a really important piece. I want to emphasize this. It's actually not the main focus of my organization. We are more focused on lower income housing for those who are most in need. So, but I think it is also really important that we look at the fact that what I mentioned in the beginning, this idea of naturally occurring affordable housing or housing that's just kind of modest that people can just live in. I mean, when I graduated from college, I was a teacher. I made $26,000 a year. That was a long time ago. I'm not gonna say how long, but you know, it was not a great salary, but it was a salary where, like, you know, my now wife and I, we commuted out far enough and we could rent an apartment. It was just a normal apartment and we could rent it and it was okay, right? And now that's not really possible. So I think all of the things we're talking about, we need to shore up those who are most in need, I think. But at the same time, we got to use all these cost measures, these land measures, these laws to just get more options out there and create a market where it actually pencils, or in other words, works out for a developer of for sale homes to actually build a starter home. There's actually a huge piece in the New York Times last week about this, that nobody's building small homes anymore because it just doesn't economically work out. And it doesn't work out to build apartment buildings that don't have tons of amenities because higher income folks want that. So again, I think it goes back to making room in the market for these other models. And I was in a presentation a few weeks ago with someone from San Diego, and he's making condos that actually are missing middle because either they're very small or he's putting them in very transit and amenity oriented neighborhood. And he's saying the amenities are the neighborhood. So his buildings don't have gyms. They don't have concierges. They don't have like fancy rooftop decks. They just have apartments. And then if you want to go to the park, you walk down the street. So I think that's the kind of stuff we have to be looking at.
Evelyn?
I don't have anything to add. I think that my cohorts answered it very well.
Great. So there's a couple of questions about the changing work environment post-pandemic. I guess we're all trying to figure out what the work from home impact has on existing office buildings, what might those be used for in the future, and also have heard about this, about constant news about people leaving California. And so the couple of questions here are about how do we repurpose or use the commercial buildings that we have? Is that even feasible? And two, will RHNA take into account the number of people leaving, and do those numbers change based on what's happening on the ground? Evelyn?
Yeah, I can take that. So start with the bad news. Office is still very profitable to build in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties. And I am not expecting a change in that in the near future. It has slowed a little bit. We've seen some developments in the pipeline change the balance of housing, but not substantially. And we were so far behind in the number of homes versus the number of jobs that even if all office development stopped and we met RHNA, we would still be a little behind. So we're not in the best place, and we have a lot of work to do, but it's work we can do. It's just important to remember that we are fortunate to live in an area with a huge economic engine behind it. Having lived in places that don't have that, we are very, very fortunate, but we need to make sure that we are thinking on a regional level and on a planning level about how we make all the pieces work together, and that we are making sure that there are incentives for the cities and the counties and penalties to be part of that plan and to be good partners in how it all works together.
Anyone else?
I would just add that there is innovation coming in converting commercial spaces to residential. There are other parts of the state that are looking more closely at that opportunity. And so, and I think it's going to continue to be something that's investigated and tried, mostly to bring down costs, right? The cost to convert an existing building to residential is much less than to build a brand new building. And so that's another one of those innovations that's not necessarily a solution to accommodating enough housing units in your housing element, but really a part of the innovative solutions that we're trying to just get housing built quicker and at a lower cost so that there are more homes available. So that is something that we see on the forefront, and I'm sure we'll see here in this region soon.
So there's a question here from David, who wants to know what some of the low-hanging fruit are that elected officials can take action on, besides what the state has allowed the cities to do, eliminate single-family exclusionary zoning, eliminate parking minimums, height requirements, other ideas. And I think building on that, I just want to ask each one of you for your main takeaways for our candidates that will serve in local office, and for all of the others that are engaged today to continue to be engaged in fighting for housing. Gloria.
All right, I had a feeling you were going to come to me first, Anu. Yeah, this is just so coming to really this final question, and thank you, David, for prompting it. I mean, you have some good ideas there in the chat, some of which are happening. So eliminating what I like to call single family only zoning, to be really clear, it doesn't mean you can't have single family homes in your community anymore. It just means you can't only have single family homes, and you can allow things like duplexes and in-laws and other types of housing, townhomes, to be built in that particular area. I think that's a really important tool that's happening. I don't know that I would call it low-hanging fruit that you can implement right away, because first of all, not everybody in every city is going to welcome that with open arms. So that's a political lift, right? And that's going to take it's going to take a while over time for the effects of that to show, but I think it's a great start. But really, I would just make it a little bit simpler and say that all of you, as people who are showing up today and staying with us for the whole hour, you clearly care about this issue. So I think what you can implement right away is letting people know you are pro-housing, you care about affordable housing, you think affordable housing is a human right, and you're ready to speak up for that and stand up for that. There are people in every single community in the Bay Area who believe that. And in some cases they are heard, and in some cases they are the silent group of folks who are not heard traditionally by decision makers. But if they see that decision makers are carrying that standard, there are people who will come out and have your back, including my organization. So I think just coming out as pro-housing and pro-affordable housing, that's one thing you can do right away.
Great. Evelyn.
Yeah, going back to I love what Gloria said, and yes, please come out as pro-housing right away. Within the housing element or within like policies that a city or a county can pass, I would go back to the 3 Ps that Gloria talked about. And one, think about ways you can protect current residents and keep them from becoming homeless, whether that is increasing your protections for renters or coming up with funding that's available for grants when people are, you know, they had a car accident and a medical emergency in the same month. They just need a little bit of money to get them over the hump to keep them from becoming homeless. Having a program like that within the city can be hugely beneficial. 2, coming up with a funding source, coming up with local money, whether it is, I know I see in the questions, a lot of people are talking about jobs housing impact fees. Those can be very beneficial, but there's a number of different funding sources that the cities can come up with so that they can make sure that they have the resources they need to both build affordable homes, but also for the infrastructure that's needed to support those new homes or to maintain a high quality of life in that community. 3, make sure you have great sites. You look around for the city, look at opportunity sites and try to come up with ways that you can enable those sites to be developed accurately. And then last but not least, you and everyone you know, everyone that is a pro-houser that speaks to the council, that speaks at public meetings, whether you get elected or not, that matters. Having a pro-housing community, having the political will to do the right thing is the difference between the lights on and the lights off in for new housing.
Regina.
Well, my peers named that all so well. I think what I would add is looking at your inclusionary zoning ordinance. If you have one, kind of looking at it, seeing how, analyzing how it works, seeing how it can be improved, how there's a way to, if there's a way to have the affordable component to be built quicker and more efficiently, maybe you know, as a part of the market rate developments and have truly inclusionary housing. I think that's one of the ways that you can have impact immediately. Also, if you don't have an inclusionary housing ordinance, starting to that study process to see what one might look like in your jurisdiction. I just want to underline everything that my peers did touch on. Those are really important ways. And then looking at, you know, how to engage the broader community. You know, as you approach housing issues in your cities, who is showing up, who is engaged, and figuring out if that is really representative of the makeup of your city, or are there some voices that are missing? How can the city, you know, support access to engagement, civic engagement in the process of deciding about housing and what housing is available, make it more accessible for a more broader range of folks, the times of your meetings, any sort of translation needed, things that just make that process more open and inclusionary to all is really important, because there are a lot of folks being impacted by your work and your service on these city councils. And a lot of them don't have the access that everyone else has. And it's really important that we make sure that there is equitable access so that the results of the work is equitable.
Thank you. This is hard work, and you all have been at this day in and day out. So I'm going to wrap up with this question for each of you. What are you most hopeful about? We'll start with Evelyn.
Yeah, I really feel like this planning period, this opportunity right now, we are gonna put in place real opportunities to build and stabilize and protect people in a way that we haven't done in the past. And I really think that this is going to be a great leap forward in the next year or two.
Great. Regina?
I'm very hopeful just about the sort of collective nature of this work and how we're just bringing more and more people in. This particular housing element process has been about education and coalition building, and really what does the public engagement process look like. And so I'm very hopeful in terms of like the power dynamics shifting to one where folks who live in our communities are more engaged and have more agency to see how their cities are shaped.
Gloria.
I would agree with all that. And I would also say one thing that makes me hopeful is all of the conversation and energy around this issue. When I first started working on affordable housing, Evie knows I was an intern at EBHO almost 20 years ago. It was an under the radar issue. And I never thought I'd see the day where it would actually be cool to like go to a housing happy hour and talk to other housers, and that would be a label that people like proudly sported. And there's a lot of work to do, but there's also a lot of amazing energy and amazing people who are excited about this.
With that, we have to wrap up today's discussion, but I hope you all consider this as the start of a conversation. And the purpose of doing this really was to connect you with these three amazing women and the three amazing organizations that they run. And please use them as resources as you set out to become the housing champion, become the houser that Gloria talked about. There's going to be a lot of partnership, collaboration that needs to happen as we solve these issues. None of these have city boundaries, they're regional issues. And so as you wear your local elected hat and you're looking for resources, looking for connections, looking for best practices, please feel free to reach out and get the information you need to make the choices that you need to make. And finally, I just want to thank each one of you again for running your campaigns. And I know how stressful October is going to be, but November will be here soon enough. And then hope we all can get back together and start working on addressing this crisis as we move forward. And to the panelists, I want to convey my deep, deep appreciation for the work that you do and for your time today. And to all our participants, good luck with the election and hope you stay engaged beyond November. Thank you. And we'll get a lot of the questions responded to as much as we can. But again, look at staying in touch, being connected, and we'll give you the numbers and contact information as we send out our thank you notes to you. Thank you all.